On Christmas Eve of 1885, an intruder struck two women in two different Austin homes roughly an hour apart. At the second house, investigators cut a blood-marked plank from the porch because the bare footprint on it was larger than the injured husband's foot and strangely marked at the toes. That board should have narrowed the case. Instead, it became one of the clearest signs that Austin might be prosecuting the wrong man. By then, the city had already lived through nearly a year of midnight attacks. Women had been struck in their beds, carried into backyards, raped, and killed with axes, knives, rocks, or other heavy objects. Most of the first victims were black women working as cooks or domestic servants. One was an 11-year-old girl. One victim was a man who died beside the woman he lived with. Several others survived with serious injuries. 8 people were dead. More had been wounded. Hundreds of men had been detained or questioned. Bloodhounds had run trails into creeks and stables. Private detectives had been hired. A curfew had been imposed. Yet the central question remained unsettled. Was Austin facing one offender repeating a private ritual, several men committing unrelated crimes, or a pattern the city itself was too divided to recognize? The answer may have come close enough to leave a footprint, but no court ever proved whose foot made it. Austin in 1884 held roughly 23,000 people around the Colorado River. Congress Avenue, the State House, the new university, the rail line, and a maze of creeks, alleys, stables, saloons, boarding houses, and wooden cabins. At times, as few as 4 officers were on duty across the city at night. There was no fingerprint system, forensic laboratory, DNA testing, or dependable method for preserving a crime scene. The Civil War had ended only 20 years earlier, and Austin remained divided by race in housing, work, policing, and public concern. Black families lived in freedmen's communities such as Wheatville, Clarksville, and Massentown. Many black women worked inside white households, but slept in separate rooms or cabins behind the main residence. Those detached quarters could stand only 40 or 50 steps from an employer's house and still be cut off by darkness, fences, and rear yards. An intruder could enter from an alley, cross the property, take an axe from a woodpile, attack, and disappear toward a creek before anyone in the front house understood what had happened. The first known murder in the series came during a rare snowfall. On the night of December 30, into the early hours of December 31, 1884, Mollie Smith was asleep in a small room behind Walter K. Hall's home on West Pekin Street, now 6th Street. Mollie was about 25 and had worked for the Hall family as a cook for a little more than a month. Records later located by researchers indicate that she had been born in Virginia, had lived in Waco and Austin, and had a young son who was not with her that night. Walter Spencer, a man described as her boyfriend, was also in the room. Sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning, someone entered and attacked them with an axe. Spencer was struck and left badly injured. Mollie was removed from the room while incapacitated, dragged or carried about 50 paces into the rear of the property, sexually assaulted, and killed with a devastating blow to the head. She was found near an outhouse. The axe was left behind. So was a trail. Fresh snow covered the ground, and bare footprints led east from the property toward Shoal Creek. For an investigator in 1884, that was unusually favorable evidence. The snow showed direction. The lack of shoes suggested stealth, familiarity with the terrain, or both. The creek offered a possible escape route where water and broken ground could erase the trail. But the footprint did not lead to a person. It led away from Mollie Smith. Suspicion settled quickly on Walter Spencer because he had been in the room. Police arrested him and tested his account. Yet his injuries were real, and the physical trail pointed to someone leaving the property. Spencer was eventually released. The case remained open, but Austin did not immediately reorganize itself around The possibility that a stranger had entered a servant's room, disabled two adults, carried one of them outside, and escaped barefoot through snow. The next months made that hesitation harder to defend. During the following months, residents reported break-ins, rocks thrown through windows, threats in the night, attempted assaults, and attacks on domestic workers. Some later timelines place a March assault on two Swedish servants, Clara Strand and Christine Martinsson, inside the same series. Sopped in their Homer. The earliest accounts appear to describe more than one assailant during a wider wave of servant quarter attacks, so that incident cannot safely be assigned to the midnight murderer. Clara Dick, another woman sometimes added to expanded victim lists, was attacked in August, but contemporary reporting described a domestic suspect, making her inclusion disputed. Those disputed cases created a boundary problem that still follows the investigation. Austin was experiencing many attacks against vulnerable women, but similarity alone could not establish one offender. Investigators needed to isolate the repeated behavior without forcing every violent event into the same series. People began to talk about gangs. The gang theory felt practical to many residents. They doubted that a single intruder could overpower several people, cross fenced yards, enter occupied homes, and repeatedly escape without dogs or witnesses exposing him. A coordinated group seemed easier to imagine than one man moving through the city unseen. The gang theory remained an assumption, yet it shaped the investigation for months. After a gap of more than 4 months, the killer, or another killer, struck again. Eliza Shelley lived in a one-room cabin behind the home of Dr. Lucien B. Johnson on East Cypress Street, now 3rd Street. The Central Railway line ran in front of the property. A high fence separated the cabin from the main house, and an alley ran behind it. Eliza was about 30, a cook, a mother of 3 children, and by the Johnson family's account a trusted employee who had worked for them for a long time. Around 6 o'clock on the morning of May 7, 1885, Eliza was found dead in the cabin. She had been attacked in her sleep and killed with an axe or hatchet. Contemporary descriptions were blunt. The blow to her head was catastrophic. Bare footprints were again reported at the scene. The arrangement echoed Mollie Smith's scene. A rear dwelling, a sleeping domestic worker, a weapon likely taken from the property, an alley approach, and bare tracks leading away. Yet the investigation again focused heavily on people already connected to the victim. Eliza's husband was in prison. Her children had been nearby. Neighbors and acquaintances were questioned. Police gathered information, but there was no laboratory to compare blood, no database of tool marks, and no standardized method for matching the footprint to the print at Mollie Smith's murder. 2 weeks later, the violence changed form. On the night of May 22 into the early morning of May 23, Irene Cross was attacked in her bed at a rear building on East Linden Street, across from Scholz's garden. Irene was approximately 33. She was widowed and lived with her adult son and a young nephew, Douglas Brown. Her son was away that night. Douglas was there. With Irene, the weapon changed from an axe to a knife. She suffered deep wounds to her head and arm and died from the attack. Newspaper accounts struggled to describe the injuries without sensational language. For investigators, the repeated behavior was the nighttime entry, the sleeping female victim, and overwhelming force used at close range. This time, there was a witness. Douglas said he saw a large, heavy-set black man, barefoot, with his trousers rolled up. He described a brown hat and a ragged coat. It was one of the few direct descriptions connected to the series. Douglas's account gave police only a rough silhouette. He was a child confronted with sudden violence in a dim room, and the sighting was brief. His description could suggest a general build and clothing, but it could not identify a particular man. It also reached investigators in a city already primed to suspect black men. The police response grew wider rather than sharper. Men were detained because they were out late, because they were barefoot, because bloodhounds ended near a stable where they worked, or because someone claimed to recognize them. Some were arrested and released within days. Others were held while officers tried to connect them to a victim through gossip, relationships, or old disputes. Police were not idle. They canvassed neighborhoods, questioned witnesses, compared stories, used dogs, examined footprints, and sometimes removed physical objects from scenes. The problem was that these efforts never became one stable system. Each murder was repeatedly treated as a local quarrel, a jealous lover's crime, a domestic dispute, a gang attack, or random brutality. One offender theory surfaced, then slipped behind the next arrest or rumor. The cost of that scattered approach became clearer in August. Rebecca Ramey worked as a domestic servant in the home of Valentine O. Weed on East Cedar Street, now 4th Street. Her 11-year-old daughter, Mary, lived there with her. Mary had been born in Austin and raised in a family connected to one of the city's early black-owned businesses, the Carrington grocery store. She was not a servant girl. She was a child sleeping beside her mother. Sometime between 4 and 5 in the morning, overnight August 30 into August 31, 1885, an intruder entered the room. Rebecca was struck in the head and knocked unconscious. The attacker then took Mary outside to a wash house. Weed awoke near dawn after hearing an unusual sound. When he opened the wash house, he found Mary. She had been raped and killed. The fatal injuries included a long metal pin or similar sharp object driven through the area of her ear into her brain. Rebecca survived, but accounts indicate that she never fully recovered from the physical and emotional damage of that night. The ground was damp. Bare footprints were visible entering and leaving the yard. Bloodhounds followed the trail through the alley until it ended near stables. For the first time, several elements aligned with terrible clarity. The attacker had entered while people slept. He had neutralized the adult first. He had selected a female victim, moved her from the room to a rear structure, sexually assaulted her, killed her outside, and escaped barefoot toward a place where horses, workers, and hard ground could confuse a trail. Mary was 11. Her age-weakened explanations built around adult relationships, prostitution, adultery, or supposed misconduct. Yet those explanations continued to circulate even as the same sequence: entry during sleep, a disabling blow, removal to a rear structure, and a barefoot escape appeared again. The city's black community had already been living with fear. After Mary's murder, that fear became anger. Residents demanded protection. Newspapers attacked the police. Editorials questioned whether Austin's leadership was capable of keeping anyone safe. Then, 4 weeks later, the killer entered a room occupied by 4 people. Gracie Vance and Orange Washington lived together in a small wooden servant cabin behind builder William Dunham's property on Guadalupe Street, then also described as San Marcos Street. Gracie was about 20. Orange was about 25 and worked for an Austin builder. 2 other young women, Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson, were sleeping in the cabin that night. The location was exposed in a way that should have made an attack risky. The cabin stood near one of the city's principal avenues, close to the new University of Texas campus. It was a bright moonlit night. There were 4 potential witnesses in a single small space. The attacker went in anyway. Between 1 and 2 in the morning on September 28, Orange was struck in the head with an axe and killed. Gracie was also hit, carried roughly 75 yards into the rear of the property near stables, raped, and killed with crushing blows. Lucinda and Patsy were attacked and injured. One of them recovered enough to seek help while the assault was still unfolding. Neighbors came out. Shots were fired at a man seen running from the scene. He escaped. Tracks led toward a creek and disappeared. The attack put both leading theories under pressure. A lone intruder would have entered a room containing 1 man and 3 women, disabled all 4, and continued the assault outside with enough speed to escape. Several coordinated attackers should have created more noise, movement, or witnesses. Neither explanation was comfortable, but the old habit of treating each scene as an isolated quarrel was becoming harder to sustain. Orange Washington was the only man killed in the recognized series. The sequence suggests that Gracie was the selected victim, and Orange was struck as an obstacle. Walter Spencer and James Phillips may have survived for the same reason, while Rebecca Ramey was disabled before the attacker removed Mary. Anyone between the intruder and the woman he had selected could be attacked. By autumn, Austin was openly panicking. Private detectives, including Pinkerton operatives, were brought in. Citizens organized patrols. Some editorials urged vigilance committees, a phrase that carried the threat of armed men acting outside the law. Police chased reports of mysterious figures, suspicious strangers, men in women's clothing, men wearing face coverings, and supposed gangs moving through alleys. Rewards encouraged tips, but also encouraged stories invented for money. The city widened the dragnet. Contemporary reports claimed that as many as 400 men, most of them black, were arrested or subjected to severe questioning during the year. The sweep produced hundreds of names but few testable links, and useful statements risked being buried beneath accusations based on lateness, poverty, race, or rumor. The rumors became stranger as the evidence stayed thin. Some people believed the killer could make himself invisible. Others said dogs never barked because the offender used a chemical, wore a disguise, or possessed supernatural powers. There were claims of a yellow man, a white man darkening his skin, a black man covering his face, a woman in a loose dress, or a gang passing signals between neighborhoods. Behind the folklore was a simpler possibility. The offender knew the city extremely well. Ordinary work may have shown the offender which servants slept in detached cabins and where axes were kept. Moving through yards, alleys, hotels, stables, or kitchens could have made the back routes familiar. He may not have needed any special method to avoid dogs if some animals already knew his scent. Some properties lacked effective dogs, or later stories exaggerated how silent every attack had been. Modern geographic analysis places much of the activity within a walkable core of 19th-century Austin. Several scenes sat near Guytown, the mixed-race district of saloons, gambling rooms, brothels, hotels, and restaurants around Lower Congress Avenue. Freedmen's communities lay within walking distance: Shoal Creek, Waller Creek, the rail line, Waller Creek, and the river created routes that could carry a person away from a scene without keeping him on the most visible streets. Geography could narrow the field only after investigators agreed on the pattern. Austin never fully did. In December, city leadership changed. Marshal H. Grooms Lee was replaced by James E. Lucy, a former Texas Ranger. The police force was expanded. A midnight curfew was imposed. Saloons that had remained open through the night were ordered to close. Vagrants and strangers were pushed out. Residents armed themselves and waited. Then Christmas Eve arrived. Susan Hancock was 41, the wife of carpenter Moses Hancock and the mother of 2 daughters, Lena and Ida. The family had moved to Austin earlier that year and lived on East Water Street, close to the Colorado River. On the evening of December 24, the daughters went to a Christmas party. Susan slept in one of their beds. Moses slept elsewhere in the house. Before about 11:30, an intruder entered. Susan was struck in the head with an axe while she slept and carried into the backyard. Moses awoke to a noise, went outside, and saw a figure over his wife. According to the account later presented, he threw a brick at the intruder. The man fled over a fence into an alley. Moses tried to cut him off by running around the east side of the house. The offender went west instead, toward Congress Avenue. Susan was still alive. She suffered for 3 days before dying on December 28. The attack closely matched the earlier sequence. A sleeping woman, a blow to the head, removal to the rear yard, and an interrupted offender fleeing through an alley. Susan, however, was white, married, and living in the main family home. Newspapers and city leaders responded with an urgency that had not followed the first murders of black women. Austin had barely begun reacting when another alarm came. About an hour after Susan Hancock's attack, 17-year-old Eula Phillips was found outside her family home on West Hickory Street, now 8th Street. She had been struck while sleeping, carried into the backyard, raped, and killed. The weapon was again an axe, with the blunt end apparently used in the attack. Her husband, 24-year-old James "Jimmy" Phillips, had also been struck and injured. Their infant son was left alive inside the house. The two homes were roughly 7/10 of a mile apart, a walk of about 15 minutes. A person fleeing west from the Hancock property could have reached the Phillips area within the available time. There was another possible link. Eula had reportedly been at May Tobin's house on Congress Avenue that evening. The establishment stood near the route between the scenes. Later writers have suggested that the Hancock attacker may have crossed that property, seen Eula, and followed her home. That is possible, but it is not proven. No surviving evidence establishes that a particular man watched her, followed her cab, or selected her after a confrontation. One piece of evidence from the second scene cut directly across the domestic theory. Police found bloody barefoot impressions on the Phillips property. One impression remained clear enough on a porch plank that investigators later cut the board out and carried it into court. The print was unusually large and appeared distinctly marked by the toes. Jimmy Phillips's foot did not match it. The larger print should have pulled attention toward an intruder. Instead, Jimmy became the focus. The case against him was built largely around motive and character. Witnesses said he had threatened to kill Eula if he discovered she was unfaithful. The prosecution presented evidence that the marriage was troubled, that Jimmy drank, and that Eula had relationships outside the marriage. Her movements on Christmas Eve were examined in humiliating detail. Her work or visits connected to May Tobin's establishment became public spectacle. Eula was 14 when she married Jimmy and 17 when she died. She had an infant child. Yet after her murder, much of the courtroom attention moved away from the unknown man's footprint and toward whether Eula had behaved as society expected a wife to behave. The footprint remained on the board. At Jimmy's trial in May 1886, prosecutors and defense lawyers staged a comparison. Jimmy placed his foot in ink and stepped onto another board. His print was smaller than the bloody impression from the murder scene. The physical evidence did not fit the accused man. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder anyway. The verdict gave more weight to testimony about jealousy and a troubled marriage than to the larger barefoot impression. Footprint comparison had no settled scientific standards in 1886, and the board could weaken the case against Jimmy without identifying the intruder who made the print. Jimmy's conviction did not hold. The Texas Court of Appeals overturned it, and the surviving legal record does not leave a lasting conviction against him. The legal process had consumed months while the unknown print remained unnamed. Moses Hancock faced a parallel ordeal. There were reasons investigators examined him. He drank heavily. Susan had once written a private letter describing her distress over his drinking and saying she had considered leaving. Relatives portrayed him as threatening when intoxicated. After Susan's death, Moses behaved erratically, argued with in-laws, told inconsistent stories, and spoke of leaving. But there was also evidence supporting him. His daughter Lena testified that he had treated Susan kindly and had not beaten the children. The attack pattern resembled earlier crimes. Susan had been moved outside. Moses had called for help, and the timing of the second murder placed another near-identical attack across town within about an hour. When Moses was tried, Sheriff Malcolm Hornsby testified about evidence that had not been fully understood in public during 1885. He said authorities had made or examined casts connected to the barefoot tracks. He also spoke of a dead young man whose foot was missing a toe and whose print appeared to correspond with tracks from the Ramey and Phillips scenes. The jury could not agree. The Hancock prosecution did not produce a conviction, and Moses was ultimately exonerated. The dead young man was Nathan Elgin. Elgin was a 19-year-old black cook who worked and lived near Congress Avenue, including at the Simon Hotel. He had grown up in Austin and knew its central streets, black neighborhoods, commercial district, and back routes. His name does not appear to have been the central focus of the murder investigation while the killings were underway. He did have a documented history of violence. As a teenager, he had been arrested after carrying a pistol and becoming involved in a street confrontation. In 1882, he reportedly sent a threatening letter to a deputy sheriff, promising violence. Those incidents do not prove murder, but they establish that later suspicion was not created from the missing toe alone. The event that made Elgin impossible to ignore happened after the murders had stopped. Shortly after midnight on February 9, 1886, a violent disturbance erupted in Mawsontown in East Austin. Elgin, reportedly drunk and enraged, dragged a young woman named Julia from a saloon to a nearby house and beat her while she screamed. Residents gathered outside. Officer John Bracken arrived with the saloon keeper and another man to intervene. They pulled Elgin away. He fought them, knocked Bracken down, produced a knife, and struck or slashed at the officer. Bracken fired his pistol. Elgin was mortally wounded and died soon afterward. During the examination of his body, doctors noticed that his right foot was missing a toe. Only after Elgin's death did the missing toe connect his name to the murder file. According to later testimony, at least some bloody tracks from the Ramey and Phillips scenes appeared to show only 4 toes on 1 foot. Sheriff Hornsby said he made a plaster cast of Elgin's foot after his death, and that it corresponded with a bloody track he had examined. He also emphasized that no further murders of the same type occurred after Elgin died. Those details made Nathan Elgin the strongest named suspect. The case against him, however, remained entirely circumstantial by modern standards. Elgin lived and worked inside the relevant area and knew Austin's central streets, black neighborhoods, commercial district, and back routes. His record showed violence, and the Mawsontown attack showed that he could overpower a woman and fight several men. Most strikingly, his foot had a rare feature that appeared to correspond with a rare feature in prints from at least 2 scenes. The murders also ceased after his death. But the gaps are substantial. No surviving photograph shows a side-by-side comparison of Elgin's foot and the original crime scene impression. The plaster cast, if it survived for a time, is not available for modern analysis. The precise method used to determine a match is unclear. Soil, blood, body weight, movement, and an uneven surface can distort a print. A missing toe may not always register clearly, and a normal toe may fail to leave an impression. The chain of custody for the floorboards and casts does not meet modern standards. No witness identified Elgin as the attacker, and investigators traced no weapon or stolen property to him. There is no surviving confession, and no contemporary record establishes where he was on each murder night. The end of the attacks after his death remains significant, but the same result could follow if an unknown offender moved away, was imprisoned for another offense, became ill, died under another name, or simply stopped. Elgin's documented violence established that he was capable of brutality. It did not place him at a single murder scene. Modern profiling adds weight to the geographic argument. When the murder locations are plotted They cluster around the compact city center and routes leading toward districts where Elgin lived or worked. The Simon Hotel, restaurants, saloons, stables, and Guytown would have placed a cook or laborer close to late-night activity. A person in that world could move without attracting the same attention as a stranger. Geographic profiling can raise probability, but it cannot identify a person. Hundreds of people lived or worked inside the same area. Cooks, stable hands, porters, laborers, saloon employees, and hotel workers all knew the alleys and creeks. Elgin's location keeps him inside the possible field. The footprint makes him unusually compelling, but neither fact reaches legal certainty. Another suspect became popular because he disappeared. A Malaysian or Malay cook, known as Maurice, worked at the Pearl House on Congress Avenue and reportedly left Austin in January 1886, shortly after the final murders. Some residents decided that his disappearance explained the end of the series. The theory was attractive for the same reason many stranger theories were attractive. He was foreign, mobile, and difficult to trace. No strong physical evidence ties Maurice to any scene. His departure could have been ordinary, and the surviving record preserves little beyond suspicion. The timing explains why his name endured. It does not connect him to the attacks. Each major theory explains one part of the file and leaves another part exposed. Domestic motive cases against the husbands offered familiar explanations built around jealousy, threats, and troubled marriages. To accept them, the two Christmas Eve attacks must be separate crimes, while the earlier series belongs to someone else or to several offenders. Elgin offers the only named theory that can account for the wider pattern through geography, violence, and the unusual foot. That theory also requires accepting that police failed to recognize him during the murders, and that the most important comparison was never preserved well enough for a definitive judgment. Maurice's departure can explain why the attacks ended, but almost nothing in the surviving record connects him to how they began. There was also the most famous theory of all, that Austin's killer later became Jack the Ripper. The chronology invites comparison. The Austin murders occurred in 1884 and 1885. The Whitechapel murders followed in London in 1888. Both series involved nighttime attacks on women, sexual elements, public panic, sensational newspapers, and an unidentified offender. But the similarities weaken under examination. The Austin victims were usually attacked while sleeping in private residences, often struck with an axe or blunt object, and frequently moved into yards. The canonical Whitechapel victims were attacked in public or semi-public spaces, and killed with a knife with a different pattern of mutilation. No travel record connects a credible Austin suspect to London. No shared fingerprint, handwriting, weapon, or witness description links the cases. The Jack the Ripper connection appears to have grown from newspaper speculation, not evidence developed by either investigation. The two mysteries are close in time, but no documented bridge joins them. Even the name Servant Girl Annihilator belongs partly to legend. William Sidney Porter, later famous as O. Henry, lived in Austin during the murders. In a private letter written in 1885, he jokingly referred to servant girl annihilators, using the plural. The phrase was later republished and became attached to the unknown killer. Contemporary newspapers more often use descriptions such as the Midnight Assassin, Fiend, Demon, or Murderer. The title now sounds official, but it was not a police designation, and it contains a distortion. Not every victim was a servant, not every victim was a girl, and the historical evidence does not absolutely prove one annihilator. Even the nickname leaves the central uncertainty unresolved. How many attacks truly belong to one offender? The Christmas Eve cases form the strongest pairing. Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips were attacked within roughly an hour, less than a mile apart. Both were struck while sleeping and carried outside. Men in both homes survived. At the Phillips house, a barefoot impression larger than Jimmy's foot remained on the porch. Two unrelated domestic murders could have occurred that night, but the timing, distance, and repeated actions make that explanation difficult. Mollie Smith, Mary Ramey, and Gracie Vance form another strong cluster. In each case, someone inside was disabled before the selected victim was removed to a rear area, sexually assaulted, and killed. Bear tracks or escape routes led toward water, alleys, or stables. Eliza Shelley shares the rear servant cabin, the nighttime attack, an axe or hatchet, and reported footprints. Irene Cross shares the sleeping victim and the barefoot witness description, though the knife and the absence of outdoor removal make her scene less exact. The differences do not settle the question. One offender could have changed weapons, improvised when interrupted, and moved from isolated servant cabins to occupied family homes as his confidence grew. The same record could also contain copycat attacks, domestic murders absorbed into the panic, or unrelated assaults made to look more similar by incomplete reporting. The wider assault wave is weaker evidence. The March attack on Clara Strand and Christine Martinson may have involved more than one assailant, while Clara Dick's case had a domestic suspect. Those incidents show how much violence surrounded the recognized series, but they cannot be assigned to the same offender simply because domestic workers were attacked at night. Austin moved between these competing explanations without building one preserved comparison across the scenes. Officials blamed gangs, arrested boyfriends or husbands, detained scores of black men, hired private detectives, and finally imposed a curfew. Footprints, wound patterns, routes, witness statements, and suspect timelines were gathered under different theories rather than tested as one body of evidence. The physical evidence suffered. Crime scenes were crowded by neighbors, employers, reporters, doctors, police, and curious residents. Bodies were moved, weapons were handled. Footprints were measured, followed, cut from floors, or cast in plaster, but not always recorded in a way that survives. Blood could be identified only as blood, not linked to a particular person. Hair and fibers had almost no evidentiary value. There was no method to recover a latent fingerprint and compare it across scenes. Even the concept of preserving an offender's biological material did not exist. Today, investigators would first separate linked scenes from unrelated ones. DNA from the sexual assaults could be compared across cases, while touch DNA and fingerprints might be recovered from weapons, windows, and doors. Examiners would compare blood patterns, barefoot impressions, tool marks, hair, fibers, and other trace material. Detectives would reconstruct the travel time between the Hancock and Phillips homes, check work schedules around hotels, stables, restaurants, and private houses, and search offender databases for men with violent sexual histories and an unusual foot. In 1885, Austin had a blood-marked board. The board carried real information. It suggested an intruder with a larger foot than Jimmy Phillips, and the toe marks may have pointed toward a physical abnormality. It could weaken the prosecution's domestic theory, but it could not produce a name by itself. Bloodhounds offered another limited tool. They could follow a fresh scent, but a trail ending at a stable often led officers to whoever happened to be working there. Stables also mixed human and animal scents, churned the ground, and gave a knowledgeable offender a place to break a trail. Douglas Brown's description had value at the level of build, clothing, and bare feet. Darkness, terror, and the racial assumptions of the period sharply limited its value as identification. Axes carried even less identifying value. They appeared repeatedly, but they were common household tools kept in yards and wood piles. Leaving one behind might reflect a repeated habit or simply the use of whatever weapon was available at the scene. The clues, therefore, form a hierarchy rather than a single chain. that changes the value of the four-toed print. Later testimony connected the unusual toe pattern most clearly to the Ramey and Phillips evidence, not to every scene. Even a genuine match to Nathan Elgin would therefore tie him first to particular tracks. Investigators would still have to prove that those tracks belonged to the attacker and that the same man committed the rest of the murders. Elgin was never charged and never confronted with that evidence. No defense lawyer tested Sheriff Hornsby's comparison in a trial covering the whole series, and no modern examiner has seen the original casts. No surviving record places Elgin at any victim's home on the relevant nights. The theory depends on fragments drawn from contemporary reports, later testimony, retrospective memory, and evidence objects that have disappeared. It is possible that Elgin committed the central cluster. It is also possible that one serial offender operated among unrelated domestic violence, sexual assaults, robberies, and opportunistic crimes. The strongest obstacle to a one-offender conclusion is the loss of forensic continuity. No preserved material can show whether biological or trace evidence matched across scenes. The recorded footprints cannot now be compared reliably for size, and the four-toed feature may have appeared at only some locations. Testimony given years later may also have shifted under publicity and repeated retelling. Two questions remain inseparable. Who made the unusual print, and how much of Austin's year of violence belonged to the same person? The public response changed sharply when the victims were white. The first victims were black women whose work placed them in vulnerable quarters. Their murders were reported, and black residents demanded action, but Austin's full political mobilization came only after Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips were attacked. Contemporary headlines announced that the violence had transferred to white people. By then, 6 black victims in the recognized series were already dead. The earlier investigations had developed under separate theories and uneven procedures. Footprints were followed or cast at some scenes. Companions and relatives were arrested at others, and witness accounts were scattered across inquests, newspapers, and later trials. With a small police force and primitive forensic tools, even a unified investigation might have failed. What survives shows that the tracks, routes, statements, and suspect timelines never became one preserved evidentiary chain. Mollie Smith was a cook and the mother of a young son. Eliza Shelley was raising 3 children and was remembered by her employers as a trusted worker. Irene Cross had lived in Austin for years. Her nephew Douglas survived with the brief image of a barefoot intruder. Mary Ramey was 11, and her mother Rebecca survived the attack. Gracie Vance was 20, and Orange Washington 25. Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson survived the cabin assault. Susan Hancock's private worries about her marriage later became courtroom evidence. Eula Phillips was 17, had married at 14, and left an infant son. In court, her conduct was examined while the larger bloody footprint remained on the board. After Christmas 1885, Austin expected another attack. The new curfew, expanded police force, citizen patrols, saloon closures, and removal of strangers may have changed the environment enough to deter the offender. Nathan Elgin's death in February may have ended the threat. Maurice may have left. Another unknown man may have moved away. Or the killer may have decided that the city was now too alert. No further murder with the same recognized pattern occurred. The timing draws attention to Elgin, but it remains ambiguous. The final killings occurred on December 24, and Elgin died in February. During the weeks between, Austin had already transformed its nights. Patrols increased, businesses closed earlier, armed citizens watched the streets, and the offender's opportunities narrowed before Elgin's death. The murders ended during a period when Austin tightened its nights, and Nathan Elgin died. The surviving evidence cannot tell which change mattered. or whether an unknown offender had already stopped for another reason. The case slowly disappeared from public history. It had no conviction that lasted, no identified killer, no final confession, and no courtroom narrative the city could use as closure. Later histories of Austin preferred progress, construction, politics, and civic growth. The murders remained in old newspapers, court files, inquest records, family silence, and the private letter of a young writer who had used a memorable phrase. When researchers returned to the files in the 20th and 21st centuries, they found that some of the most valuable evidence had survived only as words. Much of the surviving case is testimony rather than preserved evidence. Sheriff Hornsby said a cast matched. Douglas Brown described a large barefoot man. Moses Hancock reported seeing a figure over Susan. Survivors described an intruder entering their rooms. Newspapers recorded tracks running toward creeks, and the Phillips trial established that Jimmy's foot was smaller than the bloody print. Those statements preserve a pattern. None identifies a person. The four-toed footprint remains the case's most compelling surviving clue because it points in two directions at once. It draws attention toward Nathan Elgin while exposing how little of the underlying evidence can still be tested. If the print truly came from the killer, and if Elgin's missing toe truly matched it, Austin may have had the answer in 1886. A violent young man died before he could be questioned, and the murders stopped. If the comparison was mistaken, exaggerated, or remembered too confidently, then the case's most persuasive clue may be another 19th century near answer built from incomplete evidence. No publicly documented DNA-ready evidence is known to survive that could settle the question. No publicly known evidence box has emerged with biological material suitable for genealogy, and no verified photograph preserves the footprint at scale. The original scenes have been rebuilt, paved over, demolished, or absorbed into modern Austin. The people who knew the victims are gone. 8 names remain attached to the recognized series: Mollie Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, Orange Washington, Gracie Vance, Susan Hancock, and Eula Phillips. More names belong to the wounded survivors: Walter Spencer, Rebecca Ramey, Lucinda Body, Patsy Gibson, James Phillips, and others attacked during the same year. Nathan Elgin may have been responsible, or he may have been a violent man whose missing toe gave a damaged investigation its most convincing near answer. Husbands were accused because the victims were their wives. Black men were swept up because the city expected a black assailant. Strangers and men who disappeared drew suspicion because they were difficult to trace. By the time Austin treated the murders as one public emergency, the original scenes had been disturbed, the prints unevenly recorded, and suspects pursued under competing theories. The surviving clues never formed a chain strong enough to hold a name. On New Year's Eve 1884, bear tracks crossed fresh snow from Mollie Smith's body toward Shoal Creek. On Christmas Eve 1885, another bear print remained in blood on a porch plank. Between those two impressions lay a year of deaths, false arrests, broken families, frightened neighborhoods, and evidence that could never be tested again. The tracks showed that someone had been there. More than a century later, they still do not tell us who walked away.